Hi, I'm Sally Stanhope, and this is my performance task. Now, you have asked me to create a 7 to 10 minute video that shows how I would be as an educational facilitator. I am not a sage on the stage. How I facilitate historical experiences with students is I dialogue with them. So this was very difficult for me to do. And so what I did was I created and designed a historical experience that would take 45 minutes. Don't worry, I'm not putting you through it today. But essentially, this would not be me just talking like I'm going to do today for you. It would be me interacting with students, guiding them through primary sources, having them take evidence and make their own conclusions. So, most of what you're going to see today is me narrating what this experience would look like for students. But there's one segment that's going to be exactly as it would be as students. I hope this gives you an idea of what I could add as educational facilitator to the Atlanta History Center. I've written a personal narrative from the diaries of Laura Towne. And this is kind of the framework of this lesson to look at civil rights and the activists who fought for the civil rights in the Reconstruction period. So let's go ahead and delve into what this would be like for students. It would start with a Jay-Z quote that he said shortly after Obama was elected to have them dialogue and let me get a sense of what they know about civil rights and what they think of when they think of civil rights. It would also allow me to guide them to understand the why of the lesson, which is that we often only think of the 1950s and 1960s when we think of civil rights, and we think that the fight for them is over, that we've had a Black president, that all people can live to their full potential in America, and that civil rights, in fact, are not inevitable, and that we constantly have to fight for them. And the fight for them not only goes on and on into the future, but it started much earlier than the 1950s and 1960s that we often celebrate as the pinnacle of the civil rights movement. There were many other individuals and stories that capture the intensity of this fight. And we're going to go to the origin, the constitutional origin of equal rights, and examine the first activist who fought for these rights. And the period that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was written, and that many people in the country tried to secure these rights for Black Americans, a prominent historian called Eric Foner calls the second founding because they are so essential to the meaning of what it means to be American. Now, I not only want students to walk away from this lesson understanding how essential the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are and what they mean, both for Black Americans during Reconstruction, but I also want them to be motivated to look into lesser known civil rights activists. Hopefully, this will trigger their interest into the exhibit Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow. This is where I drew my inspiration and learned about Laura Towne. And I also, and you'll see, that I want students to engage with the present. What issues today may limit people's 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? So we're then going to proceed into the amendments, and students would use the handout and I would guide them through putting this in their own language, making this concise, and understanding what these amendments meant. And at this point, they would just put it in their own language. We won't go and consider the meaning of these amendments in the 21st century till after the dialogue from Laura Towne. And finally, we get to Laura Towne. So Laura Towne was a white woman who dedicated her career as an educator from 1862 to 1901 to the community in St. Helena off the coast of South Carolina. And this community was made up of the 10,000 slaves that had refused to leave when the island was liberated from the Confederacy. And so let's go ahead and hear from Laura Towne. Political times are simply frightful. Men are shot at, hounded down, trapped, and intimidated in every way possible. It's unacceptable. My student's father, Robert Smalls, a respected member of the House of Representatives who has diligently served the interests of his constituents, faced a gun-wielding horde of over 50 white plantation owners and their henchmen, barely escaping thanks to the help of a local black militia. His supporters also faced threats of violence, and some received fraudulent ballots. Despite such intimidation, he won his seat back. Still, he alone cannot ensure Black American safety. Oh, I apologize for my anger. All these events in the South make me so riled up. I'm Laura Towne, one of the founders of the Penn School on St. Helena, an island off the coast of South Carolina. I came here in 1862, only months after Union forces had liberated the island from the Confederacy. Nearly all the whites had fled, but their 10,000 slaves defiantly refused to go with them. I was a physician by trade and was determined to make myself useful to the war effort. The Port Royal Relief Committee of Philadelphia had tasked me to instill these freed slaves with the habits of self-support and elevate their moral and social condition. Yet when I arrived on the island, no one knew what I should do. So I did what I knew. I doctored former slaves whose bodies bore the marks of violence and malnutrition. I passed out donated supplies from the North. I also learned about the Gullah traditions. The Black community had a rich spirituality that expressed a joy for life so pure that when I first attended one of their gatherings, I did not recognize it was a church service. I soon learned that they were far more committed Christians than most of my white colleagues on the island. Ellen Murray, my best friend, arrived in June of that year. Her presence gave me the courage to begin teaching. By the September 1862, we had started a school. We taught all the academic subjects, history, grammar, etc., but under very difficult conditions. We didn't even have a schoolhouse until 1865. Before that, all of our students, which was around 150 of all ages, some with wailing babies, had to fit into one small room in the brick church. We had no backboards and few other supplies. Students had to learn by reciting in concert. Once we had our 3-room schoolhouse, we began to really expand and grow as an educational institution, and we became known as the best school on the island. I constantly fundraised so we could have maps and textbooks. Still, I fear that education will not be enough. Congress has decided to pull the federal troops out of the South. Even though most Black farmers here own their land, they fear that without the protection of the federal government, whites will use whatever measures necessary to take it back. In fact, the state and local governments have already developed a new form of slavery that the 13th Amendment seems to allow. They arrest primarily Black men so that they can put them in work with no pay, claiming it's a form of punishment for crimes that they never committed. Now white Democrats in the state legislature are talking about legal ways to end Black men's right to vote. Oh, I apologize. Sometimes I just focus on the negative. But I'm making it sound like there is no hope. There is. My students, Ellen and I, are fighting, and we've had small victories. For example, when the state legislature passed a resolution that prohibited school districts from using taxes to fund schools, we objected. We made a petition that included the signatures of all taxpayers in our district. And as a result, St. Helena is the only district in South Carolina allowed to continue to fund our schools through taxes. Furthermore, every day I leave school confident that the caliber of our students' work and their talents will help them succeed no matter the discrimination they face. Lastly, I know that this is my calling. I will continue to work on St. Helena until my students and their families feel assured that their rights as citizens are secure. After the monologue of Laura Towne, I would guide students through the primary sources I've included on the handout that this monologue was based on. And we would talk about the questions that are posed on the handout. We would also talk about why it's important to imagine what it must have been like for individuals who lived in these periods when the future was unknown. In 1877, which is when we hear from Laura Towne, Jim Crow is not predestined. There could have been an alternative future, and Laura Towne was fighting for that alternative future. And even though she wasn't completely successful, in fact, Jim Crow did come and Black citizens were disenfranchised. Most Black Southerners did not have their own land and had to sharecrop. Even though the goals of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and some of the ambitions of Reconstruction were not realized, by looking at Laura Towne's determination and her lifelong effort, students will remember that as responsible citizens, they too must engage in the issues that might possibly limit certain Americans' civil rights and certain Americans' access to their 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights. And so then the conclusion of the lesson, I guide students through those questions you see in the handout that ask students to consider the amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in the context of the 21st century. Which Americans don't have access to the rights ensured in these amendments? And that would be how we would end the discussion. Thank you for your patience today, and I look forward to hearing from you.